Good evening, everybody. Hello. We're just about to start. Look at this great crowd. Thank you so much. Well, it's not for me. I can understand people wanting to come out and hear Waubgeshig rice talk, for sure. So everybody, I want to welcome you to the Munro Beattie lecture. And I want to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Nation. I am grateful for the opportunity for us to gather as Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in a spirit of sharing knowledge. I want to also thank the English Department and the Office of the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Science for continuing to support this annual lecture. The Munro Beattie lecture was started in 1985. That's a while ago. By our founding chair from the English Department, Professor Munro Beattie. This event acknowledges his efforts to celebrate Canadian literature. We are very fortunate to gather together. Tonight, it's both in person and remotely. One of the things that the pandemic taught us is that we can do this remotely. So I guess we've had some positive things come out of that experience, including some really good literature. I also want to thank the staff who are here tonight and the technicians who are making the remote option possible for us. I had a really, really nice speech already. It's on my computer at home. So let me just say a few words about our guest tonight. Waubgeshig Rice published his novel, Moon of the Crusted Snow, in 2018. It is the story of an Indigenous community navigating an unspecified pandemic. I don't know how he's psychic, but apparently he is. The sequel, Moon of the Turning Leaves, is going to be published in October. So I'm looking forward to that very, very much as well. Many of us here tonight will remember Wab as a CBC video journalist. He was here in Ottawa with us for about 10 years, I believe, and he now makes his home in Sudbury with his wife and children. And some of you will remember, or maybe tried to register for this event when it was initially going to happen on January the 28th. It didn't happen then, as I'm sure you know. And instead, I got a message late on the Wednesday evening before the Saturday was to take place to say, yeah, our baby's being born, I can't be there. And I thought, well, I can't compete with a baby. So, please, help me to welcome Waubgeshig Rice and congratulate him and his family on their new addition.
Miigwech Bonjour, Waubgeshig Indigenous, Makwat Nodem, Wasaksing Ndonjaba, Anishinaabe Minwa Jagana Shinda, Minwa and Swakamak Ndida. Good evening, my name is Waubgeshig Rice. I'm a member of the Bear Clan of the Anishinaabe of Wasaksing First Nation. I'm of Anishinaabe and Canadian descent, specifically of British origin on my mom's side. And I currently live in Sudbury, Ontario with my wife and 3 kids. And I am just very honored and very grateful to be amongst you all tonight. Chimigwech, thank you all very much for coming. It's an honor to be invited to share for the annual Munro Beattie lecture. And I just hope we all have a great visit this evening. So again, thank you very much. And yeah, as you know, this was supposed to happen about a month and a half ago. So I may as well show the evidence why. This is our This is our third son. His name is Waubgeshig. He came on January 26th. And my wife, Sarah, bless her heart, when she was in labor, I said, well, I better text Jan at Carleton to let her know I can't come this weekend. And she said, well, maybe we can figure it out. Just wait. But that's how accommodating and kind my wife is, so I want to make sure I give her a shout out. Very supportive of everything that I do. So lots of love from me to my wife at home with our 3 boys. And thankfully they have a double grandma support this weekend. My mom lives in Sudbury now, and my mother-in-law is there as well. So so this is Waubgeshig, and he's why we had to postpone for about 6 weeks. But we're here now, and I'm very grateful that we had a chance to reconvene here. I do want to acknowledge our Algonquin relatives, whose traditional territory we're gathered upon here this evening. And it is really special for me to be back here in Ottawa because I spent 7 years of my life here working for CBC. It's where I met my wife, who is originally from the Sault Ste. Marie area, specifically Garden River First Nation. And we departed here about 5 years ago to move closer to home, to move to Sudbury, sort of in between our traditional homelands. But this will always be a special place. And also because I wrote the entirety of Moon of the Crusted Snow while I lived here. Actually, when I was working at CBC, we lived over here on Gilmore. And I had to walk up to CBC on Queen Street every day, right? Which is about a 15-minute walk. And on that walk is when I did a lot of the dreaming up of Moon of the Crusted Snow, just walking up and down Bank Street for 15 minutes in the morning and then 15 minutes in the evening. So I can't walk along Bank Street without thinking about Evan and his community and everybody else. So it's kind of full circle to come back here this weekend and share this talk about Moon of the Crusted Snow specifically, and how some of my community roots and teachings inspired the story and continue to inform and influence my writing to this day and into the future. I'm going to reference Moon of the Crusted Snow throughout, and this talk is titled Anishinaabe History and Writing the Future. And the history and the future are two vast concepts, two big ideas and realities. And I should underline that I'm not a historian, nor am I a prophet. I can't expertly talk about the past or predict what's going to happen in the future. I'm going to frame history just simply as something that happened yesterday, a few months ago, a decade ago, a century ago, and the future as tomorrow or a decade from now or a century from now. And just really boil it down to that very personal, I think, perspective of what a timeline can be. But also on that micro level, I think we can understand ourselves as humans and our identity by reaching back as far as we can in order to look to the future as much as we can too. So I'm going to talk about history from a family, community, and regional perspective, specifically from my Anishinaabe side. Of course, I am of settler descent too, but most of my writing primarily is focused on my Anishinaabe background and the stories of my people and so on. So I'm going to talk about my personal connection to all those things and how that guides me as a writer to this day. So I'm going to share some images to illustrate what some of these moments have been, what some of these teachings are, and hopefully you'll be able to draw some parallels between that and the story, and maybe some of the other things that you may encounter when you're reading Indigenous literature. So I should also emphasize that as I talk about Anishinaabe-specific realities, there are some universal truths about being Anishinaabe. There are some shared experiences. But some of our cultural teachings and protocols can change from community to community and from region to region. So I am speaking only from my perspective of growing up in Waubgeshig First Nation. And you may encounter different experiences from different Anishinaabe communities. And I just want to reiterate that I don't speak for all Anishinaabe as I speak tonight. So growing up in Waubgeshig was, a very profound, I think, upbringing for me back in the 80s and 90s. I'm 43 years old. And I grew up in a time when our community was really making concerted efforts to reclaim Anishinaabe heritage and to revitalize ceremony, culture, language, and so on, all with the hopes of empowering my generation and the generations to come with that foundational cultural knowledge to ensure that we grew up as fully informed and aware and proud Anishinaabe, which was quite honestly kind of rare back in the 1980s and so on, due to the long history of colonialism, assimilation, and the brutalities connected to all of those things. And talking about history specifically, when we consider what history is from a Canadian perspective, there has been a void historically for people from so-called marginalized communities, specifically Black people and Indigenous people. Our histories haven't been included in the dominant narrative really until the last 5-10 years or so. And it's been hard for a lot of communities to fill that void because of trauma. For a long time, people were reluctant to talk about their histories or the specifics of what happened to them as a people, like displacement, oppression, and so on. And for Indigenous people specifically, our futures have been stolen from us, largely because our pasts were damaged or outright destroyed due to the ongoing colonialism that continues in this present day. So it can be really hard to consider what a future is when the past is either gone or steeped in trauma and shame. But when we're able to piece that past together, we can imagine a future, in a positive and constructive and really hopeful way. So all the slides I'm going to show you, they're taken by me, the imagery, unless otherwise noted. Obviously, I didn't take this one. I don't have a satellite, but this is from Google Satellite. So what you see here is the island in the middle of Waubgeshig, also known as Perry Island. And that built-up area in sort of the top right is the town of Perry Sound. And that river you see cutting through the town is called the Seguin River. So since time immemorial, as we often say from an Indigenous perspective, the Anishinaabe that I am descended from on my dad's side were migratory. They traveled along the north shore of Lake Huron and Georgian Bay, according to the season, according to the food supply, and so on. And where Perry Sound is in this image, the mouth of the Seguin River, was one of their historic settlements during the summertime. And it was a really special place for them. So even though they passed through here regularly and they visited that island regularly, there are some sacred sites there, which are very profound locations. I can't really get into the specifics of what they are, but this island has been revered by Anishinaabe and by many other Indigenous nations for a very, very, very long time. Despite all that, we didn't live here year-round. Some people may have from time to time, but it wasn't a permanent settlement for our ancestors. And I'll get back to all of this a little later, but I just want to show you some of the recent history of our people and as it relates to displacement and so on. So this island is where our people came to permanently reside. This is where I grew up. So even with that migratory history, when the Robinson-Huron Treaty was signed in 1850, there was some vague language about where the Anishinaabe who traveled along here and who inhabited that settlement at the Seguin River were to go. So the Robinson-Huron Treaty, of course, predates Canadian Confederation. It's a document that's older than Canada. It's an agreement that's older than this country itself. Yet it has not been treated with that sort of reverence by the colonial authorities. And I'll talk a little more specifically about that later too. So when Canada was confederated in 1867, and then the Department of Indian Affairs was formed, Indian Affairs interpreted the Robinson-Huron Treaty to mean that the Anishinaabe that I'm descended from had to go out into this island, and that's where they had to live full-time. And then what happened after that was the primary industry in Perry Sound became logging. So this is an image I got from the Perry Sound Library's website. This is the Perry Sound Harbor, and that landscape in the background, that tree line, that's the island of Waubgeshig there. So nowadays, this is full of restaurants, bars, and so on, right? But you get a glimpse here of the many logs that were harvested from the Parry Sound area. And that was devastating for our ancestors, obviously. They were displaced from their homeland, and then they saw it being defaced and exploited for capital gains. And after this, after they're confined to this island, many more colonial abuses followed. The children were kidnapped to go to residential schools. The Indian Act continued to be amended to forbid culture, ceremony, and so on. And that just eventually resulted in these waves of trauma and tragedy that persisted to this day in many other forms. But what my community did in some ways, as I mentioned, was try to push back against that and try to find ways to heal. And I'm just very fortunate that I was amongst the generation that benefited from that communal healing effort. And one of those really important things that happened was our community took control of our school. So this is an article from the Parry Sound North Star in October of 1984. And it's about our community school expanding. So what existed in our community for a long time was a day school. My father went there, many of my aunts and uncles went there, many relatives too. They endured abuse, they were shamed out of their culture and so on. And it's hard for a lot of them to talk about it today, much like residential school. Fortunately, they had the benefit of going home at the end of the school day, but still, they were punished for practicing their culture in the school. By the time the 1970s rolled around, our community, like many other First Nations, was motivated by a document called Indian Control of Indian Education, which was spearheaded by what was then called the National Indian Brotherhood, which was the precursor to the Assembly of First Nations. So the essence of that document was, our communities need to take control of our own education. And Wasauksing, our community, did that. They lobbied the federal government to hand over control of the school to the band itself. And the band was able to hire its own teachers and community members as staff and so on. But it remained only a day school. A kindergarten school. And it was still called a day school when I went there in kindergarten. It was called Ryerson Indian Day School. I also went to a university that was formerly named after Ryerson too. As a funny, weird, kind of perverse coincidence, right? But this assertion of educational sovereignty was monumental. It changed my life. It changed the course of many of my peers' lives too. So this is an article from the paper, the Parry Sound paper, of when our community expanded it from just a kindergarten school to grade 8. So that was an incremental thing. Like we would graduate from grade 1, grade 2, and so on. And then eventually I was amongst the first cohort that graduated from grade 8 in our community. And you'll see the kid standing second from the left with like that helmet hairstyle that was popular in the 80s. That's me. And those are some of my cousins and friends there. But that's our chief, Flora Tababadong, telling us the story of the Kokoko, which is a traditional story in our culture. And that's what taking control of the education system meant in our community, was infusing some of those teachings, some of those old stories, and specifically some of that community history too, which is really, really important. So Flora would come and visit. This man would come and visit. His name was Fred Wheatley. He was another esteemed elder in our community. And that always took precedence over everything else. So of course, because it was a school that operated in Ontario, even though it was on technically federal land, the school had to abide by the provincial curriculum and all that, right? So, we had to do math and language arts and science and all that. But whenever an elder wanted to come by, that was always the precedence, right? Always took precedence. We would put the math book away and then we'd listen to an elder just tell us a story. Whether it was that Kokoko story that Flora told us, or an Anabush story, which is the trickster figure in our culture, or creation stories, or again, as I said, family history, community history, and so on. So Fred Wheatley, was one of the guys who spent a lot of time with us too. And this is a video actually that came into my possession fairly recently. It's from 1988. You see the timestamp on the bottom. Former teacher in Parry Sound named Ray Pavlov, who I know through the Rotary Club. I was a Rotary student exchange student. He had these old VHS videos of Fred talking to kids in the Parry Sound area, right? And he gave them to me. He said, I want you to hold on to these for a while and watch them when you can and so on. But I didn't have a VHS player. I don't think most people do these days, right? So I just held on to them for a few years. And finally, I was able to bring them to a place in Sudbury to digitize them. And I watched them. And it was really moving to see and hear Fred speak again, because it had been since I was a child that I was able to do that. And it was like receiving his teachings over again, right? And one of the things he really asserted with the children who are listening here, or one thing he reminded them, was that the importance of oral storytelling and the exercise of your memory in doing that, right? And how crucial that is as Anishinaabe. I highlight him because, we were fortunate to have these elders who were once again proudly able to share their culture, their teachings with us after being victimized for those things for generations. Fred here was a residential school survivor. He forgot his language. It was beaten out of him, but when he returned home, his mother retaught him, which is, a pretty amazing thing if you think about it. And one of those esteemed people was my own grandmother, who you see in the middle here. Her name was Aileen Rice. That's me and our first son, Jeequist. This is from about 6 years ago. And that's my dad on the right, my dad, John Rice. So I heard a lot of these, family anecdotes from my grandma, who really, I think, wanted to fill in that void that I mentioned earlier. She really wanted to remind us about who we were as Anishinaabe and what the moments were that were long glossed over by the dominant culture or outright ignored or neglected. And one thing she reminded me of a long time ago, when I was probably about 23 or 24. Some of you may have heard me talk about Moon of the Crested Snow in the past, and one of the main moments of inspiration was the big blackout that happened in the summer of 2003. It impacted cities like Ottawa, Toronto, Montreal, and so on. So living through that, I was actually in my home community at the time when it happened, and I was there with my brothers, and we legit thought it was the end of the world. We were like putting our doomsday plan together and everything, right? So it's a really long story that I can tell later if we have time. So that was sort of the catalyst for me dreaming up Moon of the Crested Snow. And about a year after that, I was back home in Waubgeshig, visiting my grandma, because I always made sure I went to see her. And I think it was the anniversary of the blackout coming up, and we were just talking about it. I was like, oh yeah, Grandma, remember that blackout? That was pretty wild, eh? And she's like, yeah. And I said, oh geez, I thought it was like the end of the world. I thought it was the apocalypse. And she said, I hear you guys talking about that kind of stuff all the time, but that's part of your history. That survival, apocalyptic survival, is really Anishinaabe reality. And I'm really paraphrasing how she explained this to me. But she reminded me in that moment that it was just her grandparents' generation that was displaced from the mainland and then saw that defacing of their homeland happen through forestry and so on. So she said that, she heard from her grandma that they had to leave the mainland, then they had to go out onto the island, and then they'd look back on the mainland and just see all the trees being erased, right? And it was obviously hugely devastating for all of them. It was a community-wide trauma that lingers, I think, to this day. And then everything else happened after that, as I mentioned, right? So in that sense, Moon of the Crested Snow was inspired by some of that real history that I was learning through my family that I didn't really learn through the mainstream education system or through mainstream media or anything like that. And if these things came up when I was a smaller child, I think there was probably a lot of caution that the adults exercised in trying to just understand how to relay these things to us, because this is obviously way before the era of what we call truth and reconciliation, right? More widely, we're only learning how to have these discussions now, or within the last 5 years or so. So, I don't fault anybody in my home community or in my family for not being able to relay certain things to me or to my peers, because there's just so much ingrained trauma connected to a lot of this knowledge, right? But thankfully, a lot of people have been liberated to share some of those things now, thanks to the very positive and very constructive examples that we see elsewhere from other Indigenous communities. So that's part of the sort of real, I think, recent oral history that we can receive to sort of understand the fuller picture of what has happened, and then try to empower ourselves to imagine what a future can be. And I wrote about this moment I had with my grandmother in sort of, I think, a tribute in Moon of the Crusted Snow. So in the very beginning of the second part, on page 149, the main character, Evan, is visiting with the elder named Aileen, who I renamed that character after my grandmother, because my grandmother died while I was doing the revision of the novel. And Aileen reminds Evan, the world isn't ending. Our world isn't ending. It already ended. And Eden with the Waubgeshig came into our original home and took it from us. When the Waubgeshig cut down all the trees and fished all the fish and forced us out of there, that's when our world ended. And she goes on, then they followed us up here and started taking our children away from us. That's when our world ended again. And it's in this moment that Evan's like, okay, we're enduring apocalypse, but Aileen's reminding him, no, you've had that, and much like my grandmother reminded me that summer day, almost 20 years ago. Another important, I think, action of reclaiming history and imagining future is taking those cultural stories, is embedding those stories in art, and proudly conveying those things for wider teaching and wider consumption. So this is a painting by the esteemed, the highly revered, legendary Anishinaabe artist Daphne Waubgeshig from Waubgeshig. This is called Nanabush and the Dancing Ducks. So I'll share a couple of examples of cultural stories, cultural history, that I think can inform us to think about the future too. So this is a Nanabush story, and Nanabush is like a derivative kind of Nanabojo, who's a figure in our culture who was like one of the first human beings who went around and named everything. And there are two sorts of versions of this character, like the one that's highly respected and told in very long and elaborate stories, and then there's the Nanabush sort of I guess not more basic version, but something that's like easily relatable to children and so on, right? So I grew up hearing Nanabush stories all the time. They're entertaining, sometimes they're scary, they're funny, but at the heart of all of them are important morals and lessons for us to take away from. So Nanabush and the Dancing Ducks is also another version of that is Nanabush and the Geese. And you can find a story like this in other cultures too. In Métis culture, there's a character called Chijan, and there's a version of him and the geese as well. So basically, the story is about Nanabush sort of slacking, not being prepared for winter, and he ends up encountering these geese who he slaughters. He slaughters them all, but then his greed gets the better of him, and he ends up losing that bounty that he sort of unjustly took, right? So it's a lesson in greed, it's a lesson in preparation, and so on. So these stories aren't necessarily history, but sharing them is historic, because that's something that wasn't supposed to happen. Indigenous culture was supposed to be erased if the Canadian authorities had their way, right? So these were stories that were once forbidden. People were beaten and shamed for sharing them, but now we have them, and we can relay them into the future, which is quite triumphant, in my opinion. So I wrote a version of that in Moon of the Crusted Snow too. Essentially, there's an entire chapter that's about Nanabush and the geese. And this is just a real quick snippet of it. It's Evan's dad, Dan, telling the story to Evan and Nicole's kids. talking about it was early in the fall a long time ago. Nanabush was really hungry. He knew winter was coming. He had to get ready, and he didn't have much food saved up yet. So Dan goes on and tells the children the whole story. And, I wanted to include this story in the book because it was sort of relevant to, I think the timeline of the story, but also of, dealing with crisis, being prepared, and so on, right? And one other example of these cultural stories is of the Wendigo. So this is a painting by Norval Morrisseau, as we all know, another legendary Anishinaabe artist. This is one of his interpretations of the Wendigo. And if you're not familiar with the Wendigo, I'll also make sure I don't say that word too much because some people, are quite scared of the figure itself, and hearing the story can also be kind of traumatizing. But the Wendigo is a figure in Anishinaabe and in Mushkego Cree stories, I believe, that comes into communities and exploits them when they're at their weakest, when they're most vulnerable. And its incentive is entirely to take over community, to multiply itself, to feed on the weak and so on, right? So I heard stories like this since I was a little kid in our community. And the general idea behind sharing them with us, from what we understood as kids, was to keep us from cannibalizing each other, right? So what we always heard from elders was, don't eat other people or else you're going to turn into the Wendigo, right? So there was no risk of that happening, I don't think, but that was historically what the idea was behind sharing those stories with kids, right? That's something that you don't do. You don't eat other people. And that was one of I'd already, long before I realized the Wendigo was present in the Moon of the Crescent Snow story, cannibalism was always going to be, I think, one of the creepiest details that I wrote into it. Just because it's scary. I think it reflects the utter depravity of the bad guy in the story. And it really, I think, mobilizes the community against him until he meets his ultimate demise, right? And I'll try to say these things carefully in case you haven't read the story yet, because I don't want to spoil anything for you. But when I was writing the story, I was coming up to there's a part in the story where Evan has a dream about confronting Justin Scott, the bad guy. And in the dream, Scott morphs into this monster, this monster that looks like the Wendigo. And Evan doesn't address this directly, either in the dream or afterwards, but the visuals are pretty specific to him, right? And those were visuals that I was sort of explained as a kid about what the Wendigo looks like. And as I was coming up to writing that part, I always knew that was what was going to happen, but it was not clear to me at all that this was going to be, the Wendigo, that Justin Scott was one of these characters. So I was talking to my dad once. I am able to turn to him for a lot of cultural knowledge, and he knew I was writing the story at the time. And we were just, talking one time on a visit, and I had this sort of revelation that this was like a Wendigo kind of story. And I said, yeah, Dad, this bad guy, he's turning into the Wendigo on me. I wasn't planning that, but that's how the story is taking shape. And he said, yeah, of course that story is taking shape in what you're writing because you were raised with those stories. Those are embedded in your brain. And whether you recognize it or not, they emerge. And that's the way we tell our stories. That's the way we live our lives. There are morals and lessons embedded in these stories, and they present themselves to us when we need them, even if we don't realize it or not, right? They're very informative. They're very influential. And at the core of them, as I mentioned earlier, is their intention to teach, to tell us how to be good people, to think ahead, and so on, right? So that was a pretty wild moment for me when I was writing the story, just to have this creature emerge in a very, I think, overt way that I didn't plan at all. And so here's a moment where Evan confronts Justin Scott in his dream. And this is the description of the Wendigo. A feral odor like a rotting heap of moose innards wafted briskly into the garage. A tall, gaunt silhouette stood in the doorway, outlined by the scarlet blizzard behind it. The smell made him gag. The creature hunched forward. The hair on its broad shoulders and long arms blurred the lines of its figure. Its legs appeared disfigured, almost backwards, but its large round head scared him the most. It breathed out another savage rumble. And after I wrote this, I sort of consulted some other resources, specifically Basil Johnston, who wrote extensively about the Wendigo, and I just sort of cross-referenced, my knowledge and my imagery in my head with his, and we're just very fortunate that he was able to document a lot of these things with us and share these gifts as well. So before I wrap this part up, to wrap this part of the presentation up, I'm going to talk about some, I think, tangible current examples of reclamation and resurgence. Just to illustrate that, history is ongoing. We are creating it, and the things that are historically occurring in the present are helping us illustrate our future for really the first time to, do it in an enlightened and informed and really proud and directed way, I think. So this is the remnants of a roundhouse, a train roundhouse. And it's in sort of the northwestern corner of the island of our community of Waubgeshig. It's part of what used to be a town called Depot Harbor, which is now a ghost town. Depot Harbor was founded in the late 19th century on our island, on our reserve, but it was a town, it was its own municipality. It became the western terminus of what was once called the Canadian Atlantic Railway, but the ownership of the railway changed hands over the course of this town's history. And during the Second World War, cordite was stored in Depot Harbor. And cordite is like an explosive kind of, right? It's used in ammunition. It was produced in nearby Nobel, which is near Parry Sound, Ontario. But after the war ended in the summer of 1945, they were starting to decommission some of those storage units, and a fire broke out. And obviously this fire was fueled by all this cordite, and eventually the whole town of Depot Harbor burned down. And the structures that remained were disassembled and removed, and the town was essentially erased, right? So after that, we have sort of reclaimed that site. It's become our spiritual and ceremonial grounds. So this is a shot of a powwow in our community. We have one every summer, a traditional powwow. We were able to have our first one last September after not having one through the pandemic. And just behind, I think, this vantage point, directly behind, if you're looking at this, is a Medewan lodge that's been set up there too. So since about the mid-1990s, this place has been really our cultural hub, our cultural and ceremonial hub. We've been able to reclaim and regenerate these actions, these ceremonies, on the grounds of a town that was essentially built on top of our homelands, right? So I think recognizing that history and really being able to assert land sovereignty has helped us reclaim our culture and reconnect with it in a lot of ways. And it's really special to be able to visit there all the time, to have this sacred spot. One last thing I want to share with you. I mentioned the Robinson-Huron Treaty earlier. There is currently litigation underway. Several First Nations under the Robinson-Huron Treaty in northern and central Ontario, including Waubgeshig First Nation, have taken the federal and provincial governments to court over annuity payments. So many of you may be familiar with the ongoing jokes that you may hear from your Indigenous friends about getting treaty money, like $4 or $5 a year. It's we can't even buy a latte or anything with that anymore, right? back when I was a teenage smoker, I would buy a pack of smokes with my treaty money. But, it's just an ongoing joke. But originally, when our ancestors signed the Waubgeshig Treaty with settler authorities, the idea was that the revenues generated from extraction, from land-based capitalism, were to be shared with the Anishinaabe nations. And those annuities were supposed to increase as those revenues increased over time, right? But they obviously never did. So our communities sued the feds and the province and won. The Justice Hennessy has ruled in our favor, and we're now at the point where the federal government has agreed with the ruling. The Doug Ford provincial government has not, and has resisted it all the way up to the Supreme Court. So that hearing is pending, but in the meantime, there are negotiations underway to hopefully initiate some kind of settlement, some kind of financial settlement. And when this was all happening, it was an actual court case, right? It was open to the public, there were hearings, and there were testimonies offered. And I think, bulk of the most influential testimony, in my opinion, again, I'm not a lawyer either, I'm not a historian, but what happened was there were elders and other Anishinaabe leaders who conveyed oral history, the stories that had been passed down since this time, 173 years ago, when our leaders were negotiating in what they thought was good faith and what they hoped would result from this partnership with these settlers, which was a shared, harmonious coexistence on this land, which obviously did not happen at all. And those really informed Justice Hennessy in ruling in the First Nations' favor. So by dipping back into that really powerful and really robust oral history, we will now be able to chart a new future due to the finances we are rightly owed by the federal and provincial governments. And it's I don't know how much money it's going to be, but it will potentially be very huge. For lack of a better word. So that's how we, can really, I think, imagine a future once again. And it's due to that communal effort, that communal spirit of not giving up on our history or our present, finding ways to heal, to really reinforce that knowledge and look to the future. So just to wrap that up, I think, now that we're collectively learning about proper actual history, we're liberated. We're able to liberate ourselves to hope and dream about what we want for our future generations, like my son Ojig, who was just born 6 weeks ago. Now, as a writer, I am not naive enough to believe that a novel can do that. It just can't. A piece of art can't revolutionize a people in this way. But it can be a document or a snapshot, and through imagination and speculation, we can consider a future of our own. It's very exciting for me to be able to do that. And there's still a long way to go, obviously. Our languages need to be revived. There is no reconciliation without a full restoration of Indigenous languages. But awareness and cultural revival are happening exponentially. And now we're finally able to fill that void of history and control our own narrative. And I'm really excited about what's to come, and I'm just really proud and privileged to be able to contribute to this overall movement. Chimigwech.
This is why I needed that step stool. Don't you laugh. This is a wonderful, not just a learning opportunity, it is that, but it's also an opportunity for us to come together. And these moments are so, so, so important. And they're not just important for Indigenous people, they're very important for those of us who come from settler nations, right? From settler backgrounds, for us to understand that unless we are actually in communion with one another, and I think that's a lot of what's going on in your novel, at least I see a lot of that, this is where the hope is. The thing that I really, really enjoyed so much about reading your novel was the sense of hope. I mean, there's some dark moments, don't get me wrong.
Cannibalism.
Cannibalism, yeah. But that sense of hope is so, so important for all of us. So what we want to do now is open this up. If anybody's got a question, there is a microphone over here. If you can line yourselves up over there and ask any questions about the talk, about the novel, about the one that's coming. I'm a little worried about the one that's coming, since the other one sort of predisposed us to a pandemic. What are you going to give us now? Does anybody have anything they would like to say, like to comment on, or a question that you'd like to put out there? Oh, this is like my 8:30 class.
Feel free to ask anything, too. There's nothing off limits.
Having volunteered in a few Indigenous film festivals and talking to many filmmakers, you're seeing more and more, how would you say, positive stories, like just characters, Indigenous person just being themselves, or characters, and complex and the whole bit. How are you seeing it in the writing area? Are you seeing more of that? No, I'm not saying it should be an either or. We need to remind ourselves many times that what's happened, but also good to see as well as people, being themselves and complex as it may be.
Yeah, good question. I think we're seeing more of that for sure. I think there's still a lot of healing that needs to happen too. And, we're still seeing a lot of works, artistic works, whether they're books or films, focused on the response to trauma, because it's in everything, no matter what. Like, even if, your life was fairly, positive and you didn't, I think, suffer trauma firsthand, you still witness it in your community, right? And it can be really, disheartening to say the least, once you start to understand, the real history. And trying to explore those things, and trying to convey your own humanity is really hard to do without confronting that trauma head on, right? So there are a lot of important books that really focus on that, and those need to be there. We need to be reading about these things. I think collectively, once we're all able to do that and learn from each other and heal from that trauma and understanding it, I think we'll start seeing more, joyfully specific works. They exist now for sure. But we'll see like a lot of authors really branch out into a lot of other genres too, and not just in the sort of literary fiction genre where we're talking about, our community realities and our responses to these things. So yeah, in film we're seeing like that sovereignty being asserted. In the wake of, I think, exploring those traumatic things too, right? So it's a really, I think, encouraging wave that we'll all collectively get to experience together for sure.
Thank you. One of the things that I have been noticing is a lot more, because I teach drama, so I'm constantly looking at what's happening in theater, and there's a lot more that's going on in theater now that are telling Indigenous tales. And I don't know if any of you have had a chance, I think it closes tonight. GCTC has had a show on called The Unplugging. And it reminded me, I saw it the other night, and I thought specifically of your novel, because it's very much about a post-apocalyptic event and two women who are exiled from their community in this time, and how they navigate and how they deal with that. And again, their story is very much about how they make community with and for themselves as a way of surviving. And I think that is one of the threads that runs through an awful lot of cultural production right now. That really wasn't a question. I just did that academic thing, didn't I?
But that's good. We need that.
Oh, we've got some more questions. Good.
There have been a lot of non-Indigenous interpretations of the Wendigo. And I just wanted to ask, like, is it beneficial for those kind of interpretations to be out there? Or does this monster should stay within a Indigenous context, do you think?
Of the Wendigo specifically, you said?
Yeah.
Do you mean like, can non-Indigenous people write about it or talk about it?
Yeah, something like that, because it's almost gotten to a point where the Wendigo is almost like a mainstream monster that a lot of non-Indigenous people can recognize.
Yeah.
And there has been a debate, mostly on online circles, about whether or not it's okay for non-Indigenous people to incorporate this monster into their own creations.
Oh, that's a really good question.
Just a little question too, right?
Yeah. My first, instinct is to say no, quite honestly. But that's only because of what my upbringing was and how, in the 1980s, you couldn't have imagined anybody in the mainstream knowing what that character was, right? Or, of course, Basil Johnson was writing about it, but like in popular culture, could have never envisioned that being out there. So as I said, when it emerged for me, it was a very organic thing. It was natural for it to come up because of the stories that I had heard since I was a little kid. So, to I guess be a little more diplomatic about it, to sort of soften a bit, maybe, but like there has to be some serious consultation happening. There has to be, some respectful reciprocity going on. If, that culturally specific element is going to be lifted and used in another sort of project. But yeah, that sort of consultation, that sort of respectful approach absolutely needs to happen if it's going to exist in there. But yeah, these are the things that we all, I think, have to navigate now, for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Wab.
Hi.
You have children, and I have grandchildren. And I'm wondering what are, not the best way, but what are some good ways that we can educate our children and help them learn what went on? Do we let them know? Or even better yet, how do we handle teaching them what we want them to learn about reconciliation?
Well, I think at the core needs to be some relationship building. I think it's most important to introduce our children to each other and to other communities, and to have that real face-to-face partnership in order to understand what history has been and so on. And that question comes up often about like how young is too young for kids to learn about residential schools and so on. Well, like my oldest son is 6, and he already knows that his great-grandfather is a residential school survivor, my wife's grandfather, right? And he knows about some of the things that happened, and he's able to, I think, place himself in the story, in the context of this country, by understanding that his great-grandfather essentially had his childhood stolen from him. But now he has that relationship with him. Like my grandfather-in-law is still alive, fortunately. So like it's tough to know how to navigate it, but there are a lot of great resources out there to help us do that. I think of David Robertson's book, When We Were Alone, the kids' book about residential schools. That's a very, I think, careful and kind way to present that reality to small children, And I think they'll be prepared to understand the truth as they grow older. But really, I think it needs to start with actually bringing them out into the community, engaging in cultural events and so on, right? And I think back to my own childhood, like I was very fortunate, to come from two very different families that, got along and loved each other very much. My white family came out to the res all the time. And that was long before anybody had a reconciliation sort of concept in their minds, right? And having that familial bond is just so huge. And I think that can happen amongst community members if we approach each other like with open hearts and open minds and understand that we all want to make a good place together, because no one's going anywhere, right? So let's all make the best of it together.
Thank you. I agree.
Thank you.
Hello. So for part of one of my class assignments, we were instructed.
It's very hard to hear you. Can you maybe move into the mic a little bit?
Yeah, turn it up a bit. That way. There we go. All right. Yeah, there we go. Hello.
Hi.
So your book was assigned to my class as one of our Indigenous novels to be read, and come the end of it, one of the biggest questions we all had was sort of the consequences affected on Megan and Cam for the part that they, if only as victims, played in Scott's cannibalism. And if, because she is still an outsider, if Megan is equally punished to her husband and her friend, or if, like Cam, she may have kind of earned something more, I guess, less heavy as another victim.
So whether like Megan has sort of like earned her place?
Yeah, because since she did start as one of the outsiders and did have a hand in the cannibalism, but was ultimately just another victim of it, if, like Cam, she will be not as severely punished for that part.
That's a good question. Well, like this won't give away too much about the sequel, but Megan is in the sequel too.
Cool.
So she's still around, and I guess in some ways she's earned her spot in the community, right? Like because we know what happens. Yeah. Cam, like, I didn't really picture him much farther down the line, and I don't want to give too much away about that either. But he, obviously has been manipulated by Justin Scott, and I think with Megan, she has been able to push back against that. And we see those glimpses of her resisting him when she has that moment with Nicole out on the road, right? Like she does not jive with what Justin Scott is doing at all. So I think that is a sort of hint of what's to come. But yeah, it's just, with all that sort of confusion and a mix-up, I just wanted to show like the despair of a moment like that and how chaotic something like that could be. Of course, I've never experienced that firsthand, but I speculate about how wild something like that can unfold, right? And I guess that was just part of some of the fun of writing like a creepy post-apocalyptic story, so. Thanks for that. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nick, and I'm a student of journalism, and I'm also a photographer. My question is, as a passionate storyteller, but also as a newcomer to Canada, I came here just a few months ago. How can a newcomer approach himself or herself to Indigenous histories, Indigenous communities, and even get into narrating the history of those communities?
So how can you do that as a journalist, do you mean? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, as a journalist, as a writer, how can you be respectful and mindful of the huge history that you don't know because you're not being exposed to that?
Mm-hmm. Great question, and I think that is the first step there, is just to be mindful of what your own awareness gaps may be, what your discomfort may be too, but also I think, openness to make yourself vulnerable, to address those things, and to go out and talk to Indigenous communities that you may not necessarily have a connection with, right? I think a lot of apprehension that people feel is that, I don't want to make a mistake, right? I don't want to go cover the story and end up messing something up or, damaging what a good relationship could have been with this community. But I think you have to be open to making mistakes here and there, because that's the best way you're going to learn. But there are also some really great resources out there for journalists specifically to help them empower themselves to cover Indigenous communities. And one I think of in particular is the Reporting in Indigenous Communities initiative created by Duncan McHugh. So he created a website, and it's a simple address. It's just riic.ca. So if you go to that website, he has all kinds of pointers on what to do if you're assigned a story about an Indigenous community. There's like a checklist that he makes that you can sort of follow. And he's also expanded that into a book, a textbook called Decolonizing Journalism. So I urge anybody who's a journalist to buy that book. It's an excellent resource. And of course, reading a website and reading a book aren't going to fully equip you to do those things. But we have those now to really empower journalists, especially to start out in doing those things, right? When I was working as a journalist, I was always so thrilled when my non-Indigenous colleagues went out and did stories about Indigenous communities. I just thought that was the best, because they wanted to learn on their own. They saw the importance of, especially CBC, repairing some damage that it may have done in not properly covering Indigenous communities historically. And I was able to sort of be a colleague, be a counterpart and help them through that. So it's all those things, and I just hope that's helpful. But I think when you get out there and you're able to make those connections, it's so rewarding for everybody. And I had those apprehensions too. Going out and covering maybe an Indigenous culture that wasn't my own. I was starting from that point as well, on a regular basis. So Indigenous journalists don't have all the answers either. We're nervous and apprehensive sometimes too. But that, in the end, once you're able to do that effectively, it's so rewarding for everybody involved. It can be quite triumphant for everyone. So I hope that helps.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Firstly, thank you for taking your time to be with us tonight. I really appreciate it. So I really liked the Wendigo question, and I wanted to just build off of that. So, I'm a writer myself, but I recognize that, things like the Wendigo and other types of, Indigenous stories, these aren't my stories to tell, just like, Black stories, these stories that belong to people of color. They're not my stories. However, as someone, who considers himself to be an ally, I'm always trying to figuring out today how to navigate that, though. I don't want to ignore that. I don't want to just push it to the side. I want it to be present and in my writing. But again, there's that struggle of, well, how much should I be including? How much? I don't want to misrepresent anything either. So as a fellow writer, I was just wondering what kind of advice you might have for me.
Do you mean just writing Indigenous characters or having Indigenous realities?
Yeah, Indigenous characters and mostly, yeah.
Yeah, I think, it's great. It's so interesting that we've come into a time where there's a lot of fear around who we should write about and what, appropriation of voice and so on. Rightfully so, because for a long time, a lot of so-called marginalized communities, weren't able, they weren't let in the door to be able to write or paint or shoot their stories or whatever else, right? So I totally believe that anybody of any background should be including Indigenous characters in their works. But the biggest difference I think they need to be mindful of is how they adopt a particular point of view. So if there's an Indigenous character in there who's a primary character, like maybe even the protagonist, may not necessarily be the best idea to try to put yourself in their head if you don't know what that lived experience is, right? So, I think and this is just my personal opinion, some other writers may disagree with me, but I think, for secondary characters and other sort of, sideline supporting characters, write as many Indigenous people as possible, have them in there, right? Just have them present. And if there are things you want to make sure you do right, ask an Indigenous person to read it. Get that sensitivity redone. And also, if you can, offer something in return, like whether it's payment or, reading their work or anything else, right? Drew Hayden Taylor, the Anishinaabe author, I think he puts it very succinctly like that. He says he gets that question all the time, and he just says, just make sure you're not trying to put yourself in those shoes and really adopt that point of view, because it may not be authentic. And of course, Indigenous people are going to be able to see through that inauthenticity too, right? Just keep other readers in mind, and don't be afraid to reach out to people if you want them to read their stuff, to make sure you're on the money. Because I do that too, I have sensitivity readers who I ask to read specifically about women characters, about two-spirit characters, and so on, right? As a cis hetero guy, so I got to make sure I do those things right.
Great, thanks.
Thanks.
Sorry. In your book, the elder character Aileen says a comment about apocalypse. I've never heard that word. It doesn't exist because I've never heard it. And you mentioned reclaiming the language. Do you really think that's possible with an oral history like that? That
we can reclaim language?
Yeah.
It's going to take money from the government, for sure. It's the government's responsibility to fully restore language, because the government's responsible for damaging and outright destroying it, right? So I believe every Indigenous person, needs to be fully funded to immerse themselves in their language, to be able to learn it. Because without immersion, I don't think they're going to be fully restored to thrive as they once did, So what you have now is really just everyday community members trying to piece it together on their own. In a lot of communities, fortunately, there are some immersion programs, but it's not across the board, because there's just no core funding for that. For adults like me, who is a second language learner, I've just been chipping away at it my entire life, So, I want my kids to be able to learn it too, but in the public education system in Sudbury, you can't take it until you're in grade 4, right? So, we talk about reconciliation all the time, but there's no commitment to revitalizing language on behalf of governments. So that's what it's going to take, in my opinion. We need, if governments are serious about that, they have to pony up and fund us to be able to learn those languages properly.
Good.
But that's the hope anyway. We'll see.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was very refreshing to learn the history. My question is, over the last few years, I came to know a little bit about our Indigenous people, and listening to Douglas Cardinal and marching from Victoria Island to the Parliament Hill. But I find I wasn't able to get our native speakers who would come to new Canadians, communities, to teach them history and intermingle and learn from each other how we can make Canada a great country and make everybody proud Canadian, and see how we could learn the language and undo some of the harm we have done. And I was wondering how you would suggest we should go about to learn about each other, whether in a community center or spiritual places. I would be interested to see how we can do that.
Thank you very much for bringing that up. That's what I would suggest. Yeah, reaching out to the Indigenous organizations in the community. Like here, there's the Odawa Native Friendship Center or the Wabano Health Center, and just keep an eye out for like the community events, right, or the cultural programming. And these things that are posted usually are open to the public. And I think that's where you can go start making some of those partnerships. But usually there's a contact person who, can be a cultural liaison, who can come and visit, your organization or your group and do that, that cultural exchange, which is hugely important, right? And I'm glad you bring that up because, there are generations of newcomer Canadians who were not shown the proper history of this country either by learning it through the dominant narrative, right? Well before this truth and reconciliation era that we now currently live in. So that fallacy of Canadian history was unfortunately perpetuated to new Canadians too, who didn't learn properly about Indigenous truths in this country, and that's really, really sad when you think about it, especially the beauty of the cultures that are coming into this nation that we can all learn from, that we can all benefit from each other and sharing our culture and so on. So that's what I would suggest. And I just I'm sorry to say that I've been slightly removed from Ottawa. Like I haven't lived here in 5 years, so I don't know altogether what's happening. But that would be my suggestion. Is to look online, go on social media, and find the people who are doing that sharing. Because there are people who do that like that's their jobs, right? They're in place through their organizations to make those connections with other communities too. So that's what I'd suggest. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Sam. Whoops. I just want to let people know we're going to wrap up the questions. So Sam and then Fidel, and then we'll go off for some refreshments. Because Wobb's worked hard and he deserves some.
Oh, thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming to speak with us tonight. I was just wondering, one of the big news stories in Ottawa of the winter was that the Rideau Canal, for the first time, it didn't get cold enough for long enough for people to skate on it. And I remember, this is the first time in many decades that that's happened. And I remember thinking, for a young person, for a kid growing up in Ottawa, what the canal means to them and the kind of relationship they can have with it is going to be very different than what it meant for us, And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on, as an author or just personally, what it means to connect with an environment that's changing and changing really quickly sometimes.
You'll have to read the sequel. No, thanks for that, Sam. I subtly tried to get at that in the first book, hinting that there was some unpredictability to the climates around them and how it sort of, exacerbated the crisis at one point, right? And in the sequel, they're going to be seeing more evidence of that unpredictability of climate and how, the things that they thought they could rely on, the natural cycles, the seasonal knowledge and so on, is a bit out of whack because, and they don't say this, but because of all the carbon that's still in the atmosphere, right? So addressing that is hard. And again, I've said I'm not a historian, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a scientist either. All I can do is speculate, right? That's the one of the only few skills I have. But yeah, I think it's important to address that, and but maybe we can learn from those kids who are experiencing that change to a greater degree than we did when we were younger. That's one, I think, huge benefit that I've really seen of having kids is just seeing the world through their eyes, and not necessarily despairing over everything. Of course, it's scary for us that the climate is changing, but they adapt and we talked about this at lunch today. How little kids have been able to adapt to the pandemic more so than the adults, right? So yeah, I guess that's how I'd see that. Yeah, pick up the sequel and you'll see more of my thoughts on that. Thanks.
Last question.
Last question.
Save the best till last, Fidel.
Save the best for last. Thank you, Jen. Thank you to the presenter. Excuse my English, I'm French teacher. So I'm more, I speak more easily French than English, but I will try to say something. Thank you for the book and the whole story or history about the First Nation. I think I see connections between Africa and the First Nations here. And there's a lot to say about what happened in the past, here and there. My question is, what if we pretend that there is no reconciliation in this country? Because I'm on my way to become a new Canadian. I'm originally from Congo in Africa. I went to Germany. I'm language teacher. I teach French and German. And I think as long as we as Canadian, we don't recognize what happened, as long as we keep saying that's not our history, c'était nos grands-parents qui ont fait cela, c'est pas nous. As long as we don't recognize that, in my opinion, the reconciliation is a myth. Yeah. It's like the decolonization in Africa. It never happened. And we are seeing the electric car, it's another way to plunder Africa, to exploit Africa. So what if we start now by saying it's a myth? There is no reconciliation. And I would say, let's set a new stage. Let's start by fighting for languages. The First Nation languages. I'm French teacher. I'm German teacher. But sometimes I think, it's in this country, in this beautiful country, in this Canada, it's like, that's a diverse country. But the First Nation, they have no right. There is no recognition for the general governor, for example. She needs to speak French. She has her own language. I think we could start by setting the stage by saying we have 2 official languages, we need a 3rd one or a 4th one from the First Nations. That's, in my opinion, a concrete step towards the reconciliation. If not, that's blah, 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 blah. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much, sir. I really appreciate you bringing that up. And to be perfectly honest, I'm always very reluctant to talk about reconciliation for exactly that reason. I don't, personally think it's up to me to define what reconciliation is. I don't know what it is, to be honest. I don't come directly from survival of residential school and so on. And I think, especially in the last few years, we have to really look at who's carrying the reconciliation ball. and who is controlling that discussion? Because largely it isn't Indigenous people, it is largely a movement that has become an industry at the same time too. So who's profiting off of that? Who's profiting off these feel-good stories that not everybody is feeling good about, So it is a myth in a lot of ways too, but it is something to survivors, right? And I would never speak for them or in front of them. If there are survivors who feel that they are experiencing reconciliation in their lives, then I believe we have to defer to them. But for those of us who are outside of that experience, I think we really need to, reconfigure exactly where it's going and what the actual motivation is. Because it's turned from learning the truth to finding the easiest way through that truth. To make everybody feel good. It's like, okay, we're checking the box. We scratched the surface of that history and now let's move on, right? But again, as you said, there are languages that are dying. There are people that are still dying as a result of these waves of trauma. And until that is repaired, then perhaps, as you say, reconciliation is a myth, right? So I'm reluctant to end it on that because we do want to move on in a good way. I would say that not to keep pumping up the sales for the sequel coming, but in my envisioned future, reconciliation is irrelevant because everything has basically been blown apart and we have an opportunity for renewal. So maybe if we start focusing on those efforts to renew things rather than reconciling things, we can get to where we need to be in a constructive way where everybody feels good about, I guess, that direction. But I really appreciate you bringing that up. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes. Thank you all for the very insightful questions. And if we had about 4 more hours, we could maybe solve all of it, right?
Maybe, yeah.
Maybe. We don't, however. I do like the fact that you talk about renewal. I think that is something that we all can participate in. Reconciliation is a very difficult topic, and I'm certainly not going to try and claim any expertise there at all. But in the spirit of renewal, I want to thank you so very much for sharing your stories, for sharing your history, and for sharing this evening with all of us. And yeah, let's thank Wab one more time, please.
Miigwech, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jan. Really appreciate being here.
And there is a nice reception waiting for us just across the hall. So if you want to stay around and join us, Wab's going to be signing books. There's a whole pile of them for sale. Thank you all.
Thank you, Miigwech.